California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. Contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
IV racist censorship. Censorship of depictions of African Americans in movies, art, and books was constitutional until 1952. 226 The institutions that regulated cinema, including the Production Code Administration, state censorship boards, and film studios themselves. A warped and racist view of African American life in cinema. 227 State government censorship was strongest from 1915 to 1952. 228 states with active censorship boards focused censoring miscegenation, the depiction of black women's sexuality, depictions of racial discrimination and lynching, and depictions of integration. 229 states engaged in censorship to generate cultural narratives that upheld white supremacy. Invisible to the public, erasing depictions of black power, humanity, and anti-black state violence. 230 After the U.S. Supreme Court banned state censorship in 1952. Los Angeles Times apologized for being an institution deeply rooted in white supremacy for most of its history and admitted to a record that included indifference and outright hostility toward the city's non-white population, acknowledging the underrepresentation of black journalists in the newsroom. 308. 9. Control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. And to casually depict violence against African Americans on screen. 231 Scholars argue that the proliferation of these scenes has helped normalize anti-black violence in society. 232 States and local governments have engaged in racist censorship of books written by black authors. Primarily in public schools and in prisons. Many public high schools across the nation have banned acclaimed novels written by black authors. 233 Toni Morrison's acclaimed novels have been banned for depicting the inappropriate topic of and for being filthy in 1998 in Florida and 2007 in Kentucky. 234 Texas law prohibits teachers from portraying slavery and racism as anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States. Prohibiting the New York Times' 1619 Project, which places African Americans and the consequences of slavery at the center of American history. 235 In 2021, in York, Pennsylvania, an all-white school board banned books related to racial justice which mentioned key black civil rights leaders, such as Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., stating that they may lean more toward indoctrination rather than age-appropriate academic content. 236 After sustained protests from community members, students, and teachers, the school board reversed the ban. 237 Officials across the country have banned books on the enslavement of black people, civil rights, and novels by black authors in prisons and carceral settings. 238 For example, as of 2021, Wisconsin bans Ralph Ginsburg's 100 Years of but allows incarcerated people to read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Presumably the first was banned for obscenity and yet the latter was deemed to be acceptable. 239 Florida banned the Equal Justice Initiative's Lynching in America report, one of the most comprehensive reports available on the lynching of Americans, because it was supposedly a threat to security. 240 To maintain the lie of white cultural supremacy, state governments have therefore participated in censoring African American artistic work that was critical of American institutions, deemed subversive, or threatened white supremacy. 30s, black activists protested pro-lynching films at movie theaters, fought against Hollywood's depictions of black people, and tried to use film to promote the fight for civil rights. 241 Early films that depicted lynching scenes included Frisco Kid 1935, Barbary Coast 1935, Fury 1936. Forget 1937242. These films made African Americans nauseous because they glorified and applauded lynching, even when the person being lynched was not black. 243. These films encouraged and justified lynching at a time when the lynching of African Americans was still highly prevalent. 244. Many public schools and prisons in California have censored the literature of black authors. The Oakland Board of Education banned Alice Walker's book The Color Purple in 1984, due to troubling ideas about race relations, man's relationship to God, African history, and human sexuality, approving it only after 9 months of community advocacy. 245. At Irvington High School in Fremont, Richard Wright's novel Native Son was banned for being unnecessarily violent in 1998. 246. At the state level, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation still maintains a list of banned books for its prisons. 247. The deprivation of black intellectual property. Federal government's copyright laws routinely deprived African American artists of legal protection because this regime allowed art created by black artists to be appropriated and stolen by white artists. 248. As a result of complex and convoluted requirements of the 1909 Copyright Act, artists unfamiliar with legal requirements could easily find their works injected into the public domain. 249. This resulted in the loss of economic rights and protection, which resulted in generations of lost wealth for African Americans. 250. Additionally, state governments have not legally allowed descendants of enslaved people to own art made by their enslaved ancestors or photographs taken of their enslaved ancestors, depriving them of rightful earnings. 251. Board of Education banned Alice Walker's book The Color Purple in 1984, due to troubling ideas about race relations, man's relationship to God, African history, and human sexuality, approving it only after 9 months of community advocacy. 309. 9. Over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Though black people were leaders in invention, they could not access patent protections due to institutional racism and state-sanctioned anti-black discrimination and violence. 252. There are estimates that racial violence accounts for 100 missing patents won by African Americans. 253. Cyrus McCormick received a patent for the mechanical reaper, even though it was actually invented by Joe Anderson, a man who was enslaved by the McCormick family. 254. Obtaining a patent was difficult and expensive. Black inventors could not afford a lawyer. 255. Some patent applications may have been rejected due to racial discrimination. 256. To avoid discrimination, some African Americans relied on white partners to apply for patents under the white person's name. 257. One inventor, Henry Boyd, new type of bed frame and partnered with a white man who applied for the patent in his name. 258. Obtaining a patent was more difficult for black artists and innovators because it often involved working with white lawyers who engaged in racist and unfair dealings, and the federal government took no action to ensure that black innovators' patents were properly documented and preserved. 259. Black faced additional professional and financial barriers, in addition to racism, that white innovators did not face. 260. In 1913, the U.S. Patent Office surveyed approximately 8,000 registered patent attorneys and found 1,200 inventions attributed to people of African American ancestry. 261. However, the office was only able to confirm 800 of them, a large undercount because attorneys reported failing to recall the names or inventions of some of their black clients. 262. This failure to recall the names of black inventors and their inventions resulted in African American inventors being cheated out for their creative work. 263. And enforced racial segregation and disinvestment in black communities resulted in a dearth of resources that crippled black invention. 264. These racist practices suppressed the ability of African Americans to receive patents for their inventions. 265. Today, Patents are underrepresented in America. 266. There are wide disparities between the number of U.S. patents issued to black inventors and the total number of patents issued in general. 267. For example, one 2010 study found that from 1970 to 2006, African American inventors received 6 patents per million people. To 235 patents per million for all U.S. inventors. 268 according to Professor Kevin J. Green's testimony before the California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. American copyright law disadvantages African American creators because it enables appropriation and undercompensation. 269 There are significant disparities in how black and white music performers have been compensated for copyright use. 270 Professor Green stated, "Not just some problem that happened 200 years ago, it's a problem that's ongoing and happening today." 271 Throughout American history, the federal government historically deprived African American artists and innovators of intellectual property rights, copyright protections. Protections resulting in intellectual and cultural theft and exploitation. Only 3% of U.S. patents. African American inventors from 1970 to 2006. Estimates that racial violence accounts for 1,100 missing patents that should have been given to African Americans. Cyrus McCormick received a patent for the mechanical reaper, even though it was actually invented by Joe Anderson, a man who was enslaved by the McCormick family. 10. Chapter 9. Over creative, cultural, and intellectual life.